Greetings from the International Council for Small Business. This is Professor Ayman Tarabishi, ICSB Executive Director, and also the Deputy Chair of the Department of Management at the GW School of Business. We are delighted here to have the International Labor Organization with an excellent presentation this morning. Mrs. Susanna, greetings from Washington, D.C., and greetings for all our participants from around the world. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you, Ayman.
So let us get to the point. We're a little bit behind here, and we have a lot of attendees here. So why don't I give you the floor, and you can introduce the session, and then we'll get into more of the questions here. So what I like to do for everybody, as she is presenting, or if you have pressing questions right from the beginning, so please put them in the chat section while we're taking notes, and we'll get back to them as we move forward. Sounds good? Susanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I just share my screen. Let me just know if you can see it.
Yes, we do. Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So hello, everyone. As has been said, my name is Susana Puerto. I work for the International Labor Organization, and among different tasks, I am coordinating the Global Initiative on Decent Jobs for Youth, which is a UN effort to scale up action and impact on youth employment. These are unprecedented times that require a lot of solidarity, a lot of commitment from everybody and on all sides. And we thought that it was very important to bring this conversation around young people, particularly their situation in the labor market today, as labor markets and economies are being hit terribly by the pandemic. So the presentation is very much an attempt to kickstart a conversation with you. And as Ayman asked you guys, it is important that we continue this conversation. So if you have questions, and if you see that there are some questions that we are not answering in this webinar, please put them in the list, and this will be very interesting for us to keep track of and to come back to you or to push for research pieces within the ILO, but also across partners of the Global Initiative on Decent Jobs for Youth. So without further ado, I will just move to the next slide. What we're seeing today is a drastic pandemic that is hitting every single worker around the world. There are 3.3 billion workers, and everybody is being hit one way or another. Yesterday, you may have seen the ILO published the latest estimates about the impact of the COVID crisis. And what we saw from yesterday's update is that about 81% of the global workforce is already affected by lockdowns. This could be partial lockdown, this could be a more restringent and full lockdowns. But all in all, this is having a very strong impact on the workforce. And I wanted to contextualize then, when we speak about young people, what is that workforce? I know you guys are going to say that we are leaving some youth behind because these statistics are only covering 15 to 24, but let's start with this and let's try to figure and understand the dimension of the impact on young people. So first of all, it's important to know that young people that are aged 15 to 24, out of the 1,273 million, we have 429 million that are employed. So these are the ones that are in the workforce and that are feeling already the heat of the crisis and the heat of the economic recession. As you may see, there are many other young people that are unemployed and others that are outside of the labor force, either because they are in education or because they are inactive due to discouragement or inactive by choice. And we will talk about that a little bit later. So what happens to these 429 million young people? So it is important to understand the snapshot before COVID, and this is what we see. there is 77% of young people working in the informal economy. A lot of them, 54%, are wage and salaried workers. But what we see from the recent analysis, both in the Global Employment Trends for Youth that was published about a month ago, and the one we published 2 years ago, what we see is that even though the proportion of young people or young workers that are engaged in wage and salary in a wage and salary status has increased, their quality of jobs has decreased. So we see a lot of temporary work, a lot of casual work there. And at the same time, we have a lot of young people that are contributing family workers, many of them in the rural economies, and own account workers. And just 1% of them are reported as employers. And another important indicator to understand the vulnerabilities of young people in the labor market, and particularly those that are currently working, is that there is still a very strong incidence of working poverty among young people. So what we see is that about 126 million young people are working but are not earning enough to live themselves and their families out of poverty. So all in all, we expect that COVID-19 will deteriorate a lot of different labor market outcomes for young workers. And this list is obviously not exhaustive. I brought here some of the indicators or outcomes that we captured back in 2017 when we published a systematic review on youth employment interventions. So some of those outputs relate to employment or unemployment, the probability of being unemployed, as well as perhaps spells of unemployment. We expect impacts in working conditions. This in relation to health risk, but also access to social protection. We expect reductions in earnings and incomes, and this will naturally hit both young people that are employed or that are working as employees, but also those that are entrepreneurs and self-employed, and they may see their sales, their profits, if they are not already seeing it, reducing, as well as the sustainability of their businesses. And last but not least, we may also see, and some of you, particularly those that are engaged already in trade unions and are active in terms of representing the voices of young people, may have seen already an impact in terms of inability to speak up or to participate, or in those situations, the heat of the crisis is changing the way some members in the world of work are reacting. So it may also imply that some of the contractual arrangements that young people are having will be also deteriorated, either because they will start in 0-hour contracts or they will stop having writing contracts. So a lot of different issues, and I will try to address and discuss some of these issues as we have seen from recent evidence. And here it's important to give a caveat that there is not a lot of evidence. And similarly, as it happened in the previous crisis in 2008, which by no means is comparable, this is much, much worse. The first data that we start having is data around the developed world, the developed countries, where labor market statistics and indicators are up to date, and some of them are more sensitive to the changes in the economy. So we are able to capture and understand what are those impacts. So with that caveat, I will show some of those impacts, and let me start first with unemployment and earnings. So what we see generally is that youth labor market outcomes are very sensitive to business cycles. So when business cycles go down and we are in economic downturns, it's more likely that the youth unemployment will react much more drastically than the unemployment among adults. And the same happens in economic upswings when we see how the youth unemployment rate reacts vis-a-vis that of adults. In many economies, and we discussed this back in 2008 with the financial crisis, many young people were very rapidly laid off. This is of course something that tends to happen, and we see it over and over in different crises. So there is this approach of first out that hits young workers first in crisis, in times of crisis. So let's say there is this empirical evidence of the last 10 years, but there is also the evidence we have today. So over the weekend, and perhaps you guys have saw the article, it was published on Monday, Bell and colleagues, they reviewed the data from the UK, and what they see is that the COVID-19 is impacting heavily all workers, and workers that are working in all types of companies, big and small, but those that are younger, and there is a caveat here that I didn't write in the slide, also those that are male, young and male, are more likely to be affected and to see their earnings dropping due to a shock, an economic shock, and in this particular case was a drop in 10% points by 10% points in the GDP, in the nominal GDP. So we start seeing those vulnerabilities of young people in the labor market, and how when the crisis comes, young people are the first one, or some of the first ones in feeling the main consequences in terms of unemployment and in terms of reductions in earnings. The next slide gives us a view about what is the situation in terms of working hours. And yesterday's report from the ILO had a very interesting analysis about this. And what the report shows is that COVID-19 can create a reduction in working hours by 6.7%. This is equivalent, according to the report, to around 195 million full-time workers of all ages. So bear in mind, this is not only talking about youth, but this is a shock and an impact that is expected in working hours across the board. It is indeed, as you see in the table, it's going to be harder in upper middle income countries, but the impact it will go across the board. And when we talk about young people and trying to see what is the evidence that is coming up and how the crisis is hitting youth, then the evidence, there is also evidence from the US and the UK. There are a couple of papers that have been rotating in Twitter and by Abby Adams and her colleagues, both in Oxford and the University of Zurich. And what they do is basically looking at, based on a survey about, and they categorize different impacts, and one of the variables that they use to control for that impact is age. And it turns out that those respondents that are younger, that are under 30 years of age, they both are observing, but are also expecting negative changes in the hours of work. So for the US, what they see is that 72% of the workers, young workers, were more likely to have worked less hours than usually, and the percentage for the UK is 69%. This is a very interesting work, and I recommend you guys take a look, because in addition to looking into age, they also look at work arrangements and characteristics of workers in terms of income and let's say levels of disadvantage that is important to bear in mind. And I just brought up these results, as well as this was in the results in this slide, that even though don't talk directly to age, therefore we're not speaking directly to youth, are already showing the vulnerabilities of workers that are self-employed or that are in irregular employment. So basically what they see is that, again, evidence from the US and the UK, what they see is that COVID-19 is already impacting both observed and expected incomes among entrepreneurs, among those that are in temporary employment, and also among those that have variable working hours. And these variable working hours, they define it as hours that are controlled by the employers, and sometimes as we also referred to in the Global Employment Trends for Youth of 2017, we also talk about 0 hours contracts and how these kind of contractual arrangements already pose great vulnerabilities among young people. So if, let's say, if this is the overarching situation for workers of all ages, regardless age, and if we consider that most young workers today are engaged in temporary employment, in employment without a written contract or both, then we can already anticipate a very heavy toll of the crisis on young people, on young workers. And I would like to pause here. I know many of you that are listening are working in promoting opportunities for young entrepreneurs, and I think this is very important, and while we later on in the webinar will try to catch up with some ideas around that, it is important that that we think about the already existing vulnerabilities of young entrepreneurs, that they don't have access to finance, that some of them don't have access to social capital and the networks, so that they can, let's say, in a situation without crisis, networks will already help them to enter markets and to understand those markets. Now, with the crisis, those networks are very important to sustain young entrepreneurs that may not have the experience or may not have the strategies to cope with the crisis. So let me move to the next slide. This is another important part of the report from yesterday, and it's the dimension of workers in the informal economy. And what we see today and what we have been reporting is that young people are overrepresented in the informal economy. They are facing important challenges in terms of transitioning to the formal economy. And on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see how pervasive and how strong is informality among young people across regions, but also vis-a-vis adults. So if we have 3 out of 4 workers in the informal economy, and if we see on the right-hand side, and based, and I forgot to make this mention before, that in these estimates and this analysis, the ILO is relying on the Oxford COVID-19 response that not only creates a tracker, but also offers an index on how stringent the lockdown measures have been. So informal workers are very susceptible to shocks in the aggregate demand. We see it now, and we saw it in the previous crisis. This implies that they are also very susceptible to the lockdowns and containment measures. This will impact the activities of informal workers. And because of their operations, and particularly those that are in urban areas, they are very prone to contagion. So measures and opportunities to understand the issues of young workers in the informal economy, measures to facilitate social protection for them, to strengthen access to healthcare services. It is important because these are particularly things that they lack, and that are very much this is what we are seeing today. You know, all the containment measures and the lockdowns are creating a very hard effects in terms of migration, as we saw in India recently, from urban to rural areas, in terms of lack of unemployment insurance and benefits or any type of protection that can safeguard young people in the formal economy and in general workers in the informal economy throughout this crisis. And last, I wanted to have a deep dive on the impacts on different sectors. And as I said before, we indeed need more data that can speak about the situation of young people across the world and across different sectors. And this slide, what we're trying to show you here is very much how we see or how we expect the crisis to hit hard certain sectors and sectors that are very often overrepresented by youth. So the report from yesterday indicates that the accommodation and food services sector, the real estate, manufacturing and wholesale and retail trade will be the most impacted sectors. These are, and we already, we started seeing, and this is in the news all the time, how we see these businesses closing and many layoffs across these sectors. And it's important to recognize that these sectors are very labor intensive, and they employ a vast amount of workers. And you can see in the left-hand side the proportion of global employment in these sectors. Many often in these sectors we find low-skilled workers, and very often as well, these low-skilled workers are young people that are just starting up in the labor market, that found their entry through these sectors, and that now are feeling the heat of the crisis. So when we look at the information, and this graph was, and the analysis was done by my colleagues Key and Jonas, what we see that before COVID-19, youth were already overrepresented in wholesale and retail trade and accommodation and food service sectors. So we, or they, bunch all of these employment shares, or they combine them for these countries, and we see how youth versus adults, and I should know that the pink bar is actually adults. So I don't know why it doesn't show there, but you will see the overrepresentation of young people across these sectors. So if these are the hardest hit sectors, we naturally expect young people will be affected, and workers in these young workers in these sectors will be highly affected. And we are ready because of what I mentioned before. We already expect those impacts to be translated into layoffs and lower earnings, difficult and deteriorated situations in terms of contractual arrangements, etc. So this is more or less our analysis of the impact. And it is important to bear in mind that there is the impact that we feel and that we see on young workers, but there is a lot of young people that are not in employment, and they are also expected, if not already, suffering very difficult consequences of the crisis. So let me just start with what we see. I mean, there are about over 500 million of youth, 15 to 24, that are not employed, but they are in education. So it is important to bear in mind that schools, for many young people, particularly in the developing world, they play the role of a safety net. They provide food, they provide protection, including against abuse and against many kind of discrimination or segregation situations that young people and children face. We also see that because we have been all pushed into this remote working and remote online learning, we also see that the inequalities in access to internet, the inequalities in terms of the digital transformation are also translating or exacerbating inequalities in education and skills development. And this is very, very important because the evidence shows that education is key to shorten the school to work transition. So, and this is the purpose of the graph in the lower panel to explain that when young people have greater educational outcomes and more positive educational attainment outcomes, their transition from school to work is shorter. So if we start seeing negative effects in education, then we can anticipate that the transition will increase. And it's also important to note that previous evidence has also shown, and this is a paper by Khan from 2010, have shown that when young people graduate from college during a recession and they are entering, or trying to enter, the situation is so difficult that they may face large, negative, and persistent labor market consequences. So even though this study stressed that the impact was higher among young men, I believe it is important to just bring it up and stress that any negative impact on education will definitely then have negative impacts on labor market outcomes of young people. And now also thinking about those that are outside of the workforce, those that are not working, let's talk about youth that are not in employment, education, and training. There are about 167 million youth in this situation. Before COVID, we said last month in our Global Employment Trends for Youth report that 1/5 of young people are need. This means that they are not gaining experience in the labor market, they are not receiving income, they are not investing or building out their human capital. So, and it is very important to say that most of young people that are in a situation of or in a need status are young women. So what is happening to these young people today? It is hard to know. It is hard to trace how the crisis has impacted them. But what we have seen from previous crises is that the economic recessions and let's say the stress that is placed in labor markets creates discouragement among young people. And when we saw or analyzed the difference between 2007 and 2011, thinking about the financial and economic crisis, so back then we saw that discouragement rates among young people in OECD countries almost doubled. So this is important because discouragement and unemployment lead to long negative impacts and damage the long-term prospects of young people in the labor market. So what is it? What are we doing? What are we proposing? Of course, this is, I see a lot of people in the webinar, many of our partners and let's say the ILO constituents are working day and night in coming up with solutions to protect workers and to mitigate the impacts of the crisis, but also right now, but also thinking about in the years to come. So the ILO has proposed a policy framework to address the crisis. It is a policy framework that encompasses different layers of action and that, of course, is relying on the commitment of all parties in the solidarity and if I can add here, when it comes to young people, it is also relying and understanding that the rights and the voices of young people should be protected, respected, and brought into all these policy responses that we are either devising or experiencing. So in terms of stimulating the economy and employment, perhaps you guys saw a couple of weeks ago, there was an article by Gurinches where he's basically claiming that yes, we need to flatten the curve, but there is also the curve of the economic crisis and the severity of the recession, as he calls it. So when we speak about stimulating the economy and stimulating employment, is with the recognition that we need to promote job-rich inclusive growth, and that is the cornerstone for youth employment promotion. So what to do? No, we are seeing a lot of different stimulus packages. What is important to think about and bear in mind is that it is important that this stimulus package, both, let's say, in terms of fiscal and monetary policies, are pro-employment, and that they make these employment considerations or take these employment considerations into account. Let's say what we saw from experiences from back in 2008, if you remember, there were a lot of bailout packages that were trying to support some countries, the countries that were hit hard, for example, Greece, Ireland, Portugal. We saw that these packages were important effects in those economies, but overall the recommendation back then and the recommendation today is to spend and stimulate the economy and create fiscal policies that can facilitate those expenditures and support protection and other types of measures. And of course, some of the things the ILO is also promoting is to think through how to support those sectors that are being impacted and that are losing the most due to the pandemic. And then the second aspect is supporting enterprises, jobs, and incomes. Here, there is a lot of information. It is important to say this is not a recipe, and there are a lot of ideas that come from different sides and based on our experience, based on what we're seeing. But overall, the message is we need to promote social protection for all, making sure we leave no one behind. There might be opportunities to provide support, both financial and non-financial, so just to be open to different types of policies, and the importance of protecting formal jobs. It is very key that those jobs that are already in the formal economy do not transition back to the informal economy, while at the same time supporting and securing the lives and the livelihoods of people that are working in the informal economy. There is, of course, as I said, this is not a recipe, it's not a list of different things. It is also not considering when to do what, but it is important to note that there are some measures that are more logical to be taken during lockdowns and others when the lockdowns are out and have been uplifted. So what we generally propose in the context of Decent Jobs for Youth is that investments on young people should bear into account all types of interventions. So interventions in the supply side, in the demand, and the intermediation. So when it comes, let me start with the demand side, with the right-hand side. When it comes to the demand and demand-driven and demand-side policies, and this is also based on the experiences and some of the policy solutions we saw targeting young people back in the 2008 crisis, is that there is an opportunity to bring labor-intensive public works, which in the ILO we call employment-intensive investment programs, provided that there are protection for workers, that there are certain protocols of distance and other protocols observed, and of course the acronym of OSH here stands for Occupational Safety and Health. So if these protocols are observed, this could be an opportunity to slowly integrate young people into employment. And I will say also non-youth, but let's keep this focus on young people for now. There are also wage subsidies, and these are things we're already seeing happening in different countries, reductions in social security contributions that can stimulate or at least subsidize employment costs during times of crisis. There are also training subsidies that can be given to enterprises to ensure that there is still investments in human capital of workers. And there is, of course, very important access to finance, and that is important to support the today and the tomorrow of youth-led, youth-owned micro, small, and medium enterprises, as well as youth-led cooperatives. On the supply side, what we see, and it might look as a short list, but these were quick ideas that we put together in terms of how lockdown has pushed young people into distance learning. So how it is important, and we see today how it is important to invest into alternative venues and alternative methods of learning. So investing in digital skills, looking into virtual work-based learning, and I saw this week an article in the Financial Times where the banks in Wall Street were considering offering virtual internships. Now, it is something that, as I said before, these are unprecedented times. They call for innovation. They call for solidarity. But it is also important to make sure that all this, if these work-based learning opportunities become virtual, it is important to secure the learning aspect. Ensure that young people that go through these internships or apprenticeships or other opportunities are able to receive support, are able to be supervised, and are able to see their rights and their opportunities supported and respected. And it also calls for reforms to the TVET system. We mentioned this back in the previous crisis, and how important it is to strengthen training, vocational educational systems, technical vocational education training systems. And in the middle, you guys may see intermediation. From the systematic review and the review of lots of impact evaluations, one of the main lessons that we acquired is that profiling and targeting helps meet individual constraints, and this is very important to bear in mind, because in times of crisis, even though there are policies and actions that can support many different types of workers, it is also important to understand the individual constraints. So strengthening employment services, public employment services in particular, modernizing them, making sure that they are able to provide services in a digital way. It is key, because they are the ones in many economies that are in charge of providing unemployment benefits or being able to refer young workers to other types of services that the governments might be offering. And I'm looking at my phone, and I apologize if it has taken longer than expected, but very quickly, in terms of protecting workers in the workplace, measures to improve occupational safety and health, adapt work arrangements, make sure that there is no discrimination, that young workers are protected, that the labor rights are respected, and that they can also access health and paid leave if it is the case and the opportunity. And then the last but not least is the importance of social dialogue, and we see this time again that bringing social dialogue into the equation increases the sustainability of the solutions, increases the validity of the solutions, and also makes sure that those rights and voices of young people are protected, that young people can be and feel represented, and at the same time that we can support all the key actors, and in the case of the ILO, our constituents and our employers, workers, and governments, and it is in our strong interest to support those organizations to strengthen their capacities and to help and monitor and create a feedback loop in terms of policies and actions, so that we can learn as we go. So I will pause here. I will leave this slide on and I will come back to it if I have time, but I will pass the word to Ayman for the discussion.
Susanna, thank you very much. This has been an exceptional presentation here, and we've gotten a lot of compliments here from around the world with your presentation. And of course, the first one is, can you please share the slides with everyone? And as we agreed, yes, of course, that's the first thing we'll do is we'll share out the recording and then we'll share the slides with everyone here. So compliments first, there's many compliments coming in, but then there's a lot of questions here. So with as much time as we have here, let me get to the questions here. And I'll start with the president of ICSB. So the president of ICSB is on the session and listening very carefully. And he asks a question, it's a general question, but he wanted to see more of your reaction here, is what does the ILO think should happen to offset the adverse effects of COVID-19? And that's from President Ahmed Osman in Egypt.
Okay. So let me go back to this slide. Hi, Ahmed. Thank you very much for the invitation to be in the webinar and for all the support to Design Jobs for Youth. This is the proposal from the ILO in terms of addressing. There are various types of policies that can be comprised within this policy framework, but in a nutshell, this will open opportunities to stimulate the economy, to protect workers, to protect the enterprises, and to ensure that that social dialogue guides these processes as we navigate these very difficult and unprecedented times.
Great, thank you. Now, this is a little bit more a tailored or focused question, but it goes, I was wondering how youth and disabilities have impact, especially young women with disabilities.
It is hard to say the impact of COVID generally on young people, and as you may have seen from my presentation, we are grabbing evidence as we can, and this evidence particularly comes from developed economies. We need more evidence, we need more voices of youth, and this is also a call and an invitation to young people that are listening and opportunities for them to disseminate these. We will be carrying out a survey to understand what's going on and how young people are feeling the crisis, particularly when it relates to the labor market, and these voices of young people that are often not so visible, both young women, young persons with disability, young people in indigenous communities. There are many groups whose voices are not the most heard. So this will be a great opportunity for us to capture those voices and to bring them into the equation, both in terms of awareness and in terms of any opportunity we have to provide advice to our constituents. So it is hard to say what is the impact. We expect the impact to be difficult. I expect young people or young persons with disability are already facing the consequences of social distancing. Just all that alone is already a difficult consequence, in addition to the health, the restrictions in access to health services and other things. So hard to quantify it at this point, but indeed it is a very legit question and something that we would be very keen in studying and understanding much more.
That's great, and I think somebody in the chat also said that China is working on this, so there's more of a global initiative on this. So this was a really great question. This is a difficult one, but I'm very interested in this one here, and I think we had a conversation yesterday with ICSB board members about this, and the question is the following: how is this going to impact the 2030 agenda, the pandemic, basically, right, and the negative impact? Is the 2030 agenda going to be on hold for a while till we figure out how to deal with this, or are we going to merge them? I think Amal sent us a nice graphic with COVID-19 in the middle, and all the 17 SDGs were all interconnected. So I'm putting you on the spot here, and you're smiling. So I'll stay quiet now and listen to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is a very hard question and not fair, but I think this is when multilateralism and our development agenda becomes more important than ever, making sure that we are actively investing across the board, governments, employers, workers, the UN system as a whole, the academia, parliamentarians, the regional organizations, making sure that we are all working together towards strengthening investments in people, and using the 2030 agenda as a framework, or as a framework for guidance is important. Indeed, it is challenging, and the report from the Secretary General, last week's report, speaks about these challenges, but yet it calls for urgent action, solidarity, and it's a time for investment in people. We cannot afford depreciation of human capital. We cannot afford businesses to go to die, and the economy to go on the floor. So it is a very good time to consider what we can give up, in terms of what can we give to others, or what can we take away from us and give to others as well. So sharing responsibility is important, and co-creating with others as we advance these solutions is the key.
So ICSB is also a very robust research organization, and this is a research question here, and it is: what is the most effective qualitative research methods to understand the effects on youth in developing countries? They mentioned qualitative, but let's open it up for quantitative as well, and maybe you can answer both or comment on both.
So usually, when we try to understand impacts, and we try to visualize what was the before and where are we now, what happened, we tend to think about impact evaluations, right? Indeed, there are some opportunities where data exists and data had been collected before COVID, and these will open opportunities to collect data today, or in a month, or in 6 months, to see what are changes in labor market outcomes, particularly among young people. This is a window of opportunity. Some organizations have it because there was that initial investment in terms of a baseline, or in terms of a panel of data. And it is a robust way of controlling and securing external and internal validity. So that, at the same time, it is, as we all say it, in terms of what are the benefits and challenges of impact evaluations, it is not always possible, it is expensive, etc. So putting that aside as a method, right now the office is focusing in understanding the specificities of countries. So we are starting very soon to run rapid assessments on the labor markets, and this is important because there are many things that that are sensitive to crisis, like, I don't know, like financial stocks. They are very sensitive, but there are other things like macroeconomic indicators or labor market indicators that are not so sensitive. So it is important to have these deep dives in countries, and our focus is indeed as well in the developing world, looking into what are the existing policies, what are the policy reactions and responses, but keeping in mind the context and the composition of the labor market and the population in those countries. So I would say, and I'm surely not thinking about many other solutions, but you guys that are listening, you just list as well what solutions you see or opportunities in terms of research. But in my view, these are opportunities to strengthen both, let's say, the rigor and the rapid response.
Yeah, and Dragan Radic, I think you're familiar with him, did a report a couple of months back saying small business matters. I think the new title should be Small Business Matters More Than Ever Now. So, maybe your reaction to the intersection of small business and youth now, because both are being hit very hard. And there was a BBC report that ICSB commented on that we're going to see maybe a quarter of all businesses fail, right, in the United States, but this can be even more in different countries. How would you try to merge both small business and youth together? And if there is such a thing, what would you comment on?
Yes. So there is no silver bullet here, and we are all learning by doing and trying to bring experiences from previous crises and see, which of those solutions may also apply to this context. I mentioned before that providing financial support to young entrepreneurs in small and medium enterprises, as well as youth cooperative, is important. It is most of them are unfortunately in the informal economy, so coping strategies for this type of crisis, I mean, no one was expecting a hit like this, so there are very few or no coping strategies. So making sure that we facilitate access to finance in these times, it will be a first reaction, and it is very much the intention in this slide when we talk about access to finance in terms of the demand side policies.
Great. Let's talk about trade unions, right? The question is about trade unions and how will the deterioration of this, and how can trade unions play a role in this? And how would you react to this?
Yeah, trade unions are already playing a role in this segment. They were or continue being some of the first ones in tracking the situation of workers and making public some abuses or some lack of information that was happening in since the lockdowns started and since we started seeing the deterioration in the economy. So trade unions are crucial to secure and to ensure that there is protection, that all sides of the economy, obviously employers, but everybody upholds the fundamental principles and rights at work. And it is also important to think about the role of young people in trade unions and how we can make young workers aware about the opportunity they have to enter a union and become a member, and the benefits of being unionized, and generally the benefits of representation and voice. It is a time where we need let's say the active engagement and sound recommendations from trade unions.
The question that comes here is about supply chain and demand, right? And the most important effective way for promoting youth employment during a recession. What would you talk about that? Because that's been in the dialogue a lot about supply chain.
Yes, and it is important. It also makes part of the paced measures that we mentioned before. So what we see with the crisis is that those chains are being disrupted. we see a lot of, also depending on how connected different sectors are and how dependent they may be from each other, there is a snowballing or sort of like a domino effect, right? So if some sectors start falling and start being hardly hit by the crisis, then other sectors will fall rapidly. So early investments in the sectors that are suffering the most is important. And it is important because not only we are protecting the businesses and workers in those sectors, but also because we may be helping sustain and avoid the disruptions in those chains. I'll leave it there.
What about the informal sector? Can you talk a little bit about how we can help mobilize more youth work in the informal sector?
Yeah, so there are already a series of opportunities that we have been discussing for a while in terms of supporting young people's transition to the formal economy. The fact that 3 out of 4 young people are in the informal sector means that I'm sorry, 3 out of 4 young workers are in the informal sector means that this is a massive amount of young people. It is a massive population that we are responsible for in terms of informing about the risk, but also seeking opportunities to protect them. And the call of the ILO and partners of the ILO that work on social protection is that everybody should have access to this, should benefit from social protection. And if we focus the fiscal policies nowadays to strengthening social protection systems, we can rescue some of these young workers in the informal economy and provide a safety net for them as well in these times of crisis. It is also important, as you see in the slide, to recognize that some of these young workers in the informal economy do not have access to health services, and obviously if they fall sick, it is very hard for them to receive services. Knowing that it's likely, particularly for some of them in the urban areas, it is likely that they will be infected as well. So that's why creating a safety net for these workers is important. And in terms of securing communication, I think it is an effort of society as a whole. It is something that comes down with fiscal policies and the stimulus packages, but we are all responsible for protecting, informing, and advocating for the protection and the promotion of employment among youth.
We're up on time here, but I want to ask you this question. I'm going to ask it in 2 parts here. I'm going to ask it to capture kind of the key spirit of what ILO is trying to do to help support in this pandemic here. And this is you as a hat of an ILO. But then I'm going to take it a little bit personal here and share your feelings about everything and how you as a human being, not just working for the ILO, but in general, how would you move forward? So it's a 2-part question here, but let's start with the official one as well.
All right. So, and I go back to my official slide, just to make it more official. I think this is the framework. Our commitment is to keep working in understanding the impact, and our commitment is to keep working in mobilizing solutions. There is room for failure, and we have seen this recognized by many countries and governments over the last months. But what is important is that with the spirit of solidarity, we keep trying to find measures across the timeline, now in lockdowns, in partial lockdowns, in non-lockdowns, after the lockdown. We keep trying to innovate and find solutions so that we cover all these 4 layers of the policy framework, making sure that we protect, making sure that we stimulate the economy, that we support enterprises, jobs, and incomes, and that we capitalize and leverage the power of social dialogue in making all this happening. And when it comes to young people, our goal is very much to scale up action and impact on youth employment, but to achieve that impact today, we have to rely on the solidarity and the investments of everyone. And now that is a good segue to me as an individual and my experience. This is absolutely unprecedented, and in many dimensions is out of this world. We see so many crazy situations and difficult and heartbreaking. We are trying super hard. I think I always consider myself a bit of a workaholic, but I think over these past months, work has been really, really top. Let's say it has been over the top. We are doing all we can, dedicating our time, also knowing that a new percentage, like beyond my 100% of time of work, I'm also trying to support my children with online learning. So balancing all these elements out has been unique and difficult, but I think we are all on this together. We are committed, and particularly because I've been working on the issue of youth employment for so many years, this is something that comes very close to my heart, and I and the team and colleagues at the ILO, we look forward to working with you and everyone in terms of identifying solutions and communicating also those solutions to young people, recognizing that they are also agents of change. They are also in the front lines combating COVID from a health and economic perspective. So again, we are in this together.
Susanna, this is exceptional, and this has been absolutely just fantastic. We have a lot of questions still here and a lot of people raising hand, but we are out of time here. But that means that we will need another session with the ILO. This is just the start here. So on behalf of ICSB and ICSB family and the board, we want to thank you personally first for your time and effort to come here. We've seen the dedication your team has put together in putting these slides, the preparation, the test runs. So we really, really do appreciate it, and we're very thankful here. For everybody around the world, as well as join ICSB, we are in this all together here, and the work that the ILO is doing is absolutely just superb. But they need help, as we all need help as well. So this is more of all hands on deck. So we want to thank you on behalf of ICSB for the ILO's work on this. And moving forward, we have some exciting news, and we'll send out an email with the recording and the slides. But tomorrow at the same time at 10 o'clock, and we are going to have a pitch idea marketplace with the editor of our journal here, that he'll be taking some ideas for research here. And we already saw some coming in that are absolutely fantastic. And we'll be sending an email out to everybody about this as well. So with that, we thank you again. We thank the ILO. We thank you, Susanna, personally as well. And send our regards and stay safe, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.